Okay, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about the AWS Well-Architected Framework. So let's get started. So first things first, an introduction to me, your presenter for today. I am Jonathan LaCour, the Chief Technology Officer for Relium. I am a technologist and a cloud strategist. I've been using or building cloud infrastructure since the very early days of cloud in AWS. And a little bit about Relium. We are an AWS certified consulting and managed services provider based in Southern California, right in Los Angeles. And we help companies make the transition to cloud, to AWS specifically. And we work with them to optimize their workloads and to take full advantage of the power of the platform. We are also a launch partner with AWS for the AWS Well-Architected Review Program. So we have staff that's been directly engaged with AWS in formal training to qualify our engineers for delivering well-architected reviews for our customers. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And if you want some more information about us or about Well-Architected or about the Well-Architected Review Program, you will see in the webinar, there is actually a section for handouts. And there you can go click in and download a couple of PDF files, which will be really useful. Also, we will be sharing this content after the webinar, and we're actually going to be presenting a recording as well. So you can always catch up and read it again if you'd like. So before we get started, I have a quick poll question for you. I'll note this is going to be completely anonymous, so feel free to be honest and don't worry about it being tracked back to you on these questions and answers. It's really all about just sharing with the entire group a little bit about kind of what we're seeing and understanding how I can best kind of hit some interesting points in the webinar. So the first question is really all about how you are currently using AWS. And that is if you're using it at all, if you're using it in production, hybrid, if you're in the process of migration, or if you're not really using it yet at all. So I'm seeing a bunch of votes roll in. Very cool. And we will share these results live so you can see. It's a good little split right now. I'll try to give you guys 15 to 20 seconds more to get your votes in. And we've got a couple of these polls kind of scattered throughout the entire webinar. So it definitely gets pretty interesting when you can see some of the results rolling in. All right, Joshua, let's go ahead and share that. So the poll results. So it looks like about 40% of you are using AWS already for production. Another 10% are using AWS for kind of tests and experiments, or you're doing hybrid. A significant portion, 15% or so, are in the process of migrating, and a good bit of you actually don't use AWS just yet. So I'm excited to see such a good blend. And let's walk through here. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda for today's presentation. So first, we're going to do a quick introduction to Well-Architected and kind of what it is, and the program and the framework. And then we'll go through some design principles for the operational excellence pillar, which is the first of the 5 pillars of the Well-Architected framework. Then we'll talk about the 3 areas of focus for the operational excellence pillar, which are preparation, operation, and evolution. And we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. I'd also like to point out that in attendance, we also have one of our senior cloud consultants, Lance Allen, and you can actually ask questions directly through the webinar interface, and he's going to do his best to answer those questions as we go so that I can focus on delivering the presentation, and at the end, we'll have a little bit of extra time for Q&A. So feel free to pepper your questions in the questions or in the chat area of the webinar. All right, so let's talk about the Well-Architected framework itself. In 2015, at AWS's annual reInvent conference, AWS's CTO, Werner Vogels, announced the Well-Architected framework, and he announced it in the form of a series of white papers that targeted 5 separate pillars of collected best practices and guidance. And altogether, the framework is really there to help ensure that applications are architected properly for the cloud. And AWS has continued to evolve the Well-Architected framework. And now I believe it's the most complete and thorough collection of best practices and guidance that's really available for any organization going through a cloud transformation. So there's a lot of benefits to the Well-Architected framework. not the least of which is that the principles there help you move more quickly. And in my experience, this is the biggest demand on operations and product teams is, hey, go faster, right? And the best practices in the framework really do enable you to go faster. In addition, it also helps surface risk and helps you address those risks before your workloads go into production. And that proactive view on risk is a really big part of the well-architected framework. Thirdly, as a CTO, I have to make big, very expensive decisions on a pretty regular basis. I'm sure many of you in attendance do as well. And the well-architected framework helps by getting your entire organization focused on rapid decision making through designing our applications and workloads to be observable and to be measurable. And finally, another common problem for CTOs is benchmarking our architectures, procedures, and systems against best practices. And well-architected is such a great way to do that. It outlines a huge series of best practices that come directly from AWS. And that's based upon AWS's experience across all the many thousands of customers and their architectures that they have. So Relium actually performs well-architected reviews, and this is a great way to accelerate your path to a well-architected workload. We're certified to perform those reviews, and what we've discovered, we've over dozens of well-architected reviews for our customers, is some pretty interesting insight. So the first thing is that 92% of reviews that we perform surface critical security issues, and nearly 70% of surface critical issues with reliability and operations. So even if you think you're already well-architected, a review is a really valuable thing to do to benchmark against best practices. And AWS actually incentivizes you to do so. So with a partner like Relium, you can get an accelerated review package, which essentially gives you the free well-architected review with a full report on all the remediation that's necessary. And you get 40 hours of remediation from Relium for $10,000. And then AWS backs that with a $5,000 service credit, essentially giving you a huge incentive to go ahead and be well-architected. I think this is a pretty amazing program because it really shows that AWS wants organizations to be well-architected because they want them to be successful. If they're successful, they're going to grow, they're going to have more usage on AWS, and that's exactly what they want, what we want, and what the customer wants. So let's dive in real quick into the operational excellence pillar. This is the first of 5 pillars, and we're going to do a pretty deep dive. So each pillar of the well-architected framework has a series of design principles and a set of focus areas. So first, we're going to look at the 6 key design principles for the operational excellence pillar. The first one is to perform operations as code. And I've been in engineering and software for a few decades now, and have watched the practice of software engineering evolve pretty rapidly, actually, to become a lot more disciplined. Now we've got really rigorous methods of testing, evolving, and iterating. A lot of it is to minimize risk. And changes to software are version controlled. We run them through automated testing pipelines. We do peer review. We have a whole set of processes and procedures around it. And the advent of cloud is actually bringing that same attitude and possibility to the entire application environment, because cloud infrastructure enables everything to be done in software. So for operations, this has been pretty revolutionary. Operations procedures can be codified, scripted, and automated, and that's helped reduce the chance of human error. And it's actually made our applications a lot better. And one of the key ways to perform operations as code is to actually use infrastructure as code tools like AWS's own CloudFormation. And that leads us to another poll for the audience. Has your organization actually adopted infrastructure as code? So by this, I mean, are you using a tool like CloudFormation or HashiCorp's Terraform to define your infrastructure in code? At Reliant, we actually use both, and it depends on our customer needs. I find this is one of the biggest key parts of a DevOps transformation. And keep in mind, while you're answering the poll, you can definitely ask questions through the webinar interface, and Lance will be answering those questions as we go. All right, I see the answers rolling in. Wow, this is going to be really a nail biter, very close, very evenly split. Okay, just about. All right, that's good. Let's take a look. And by a narrow margin of 51 to 49%, people are using infrastructure as code in their organizations. But that shows that there's a huge opportunity for the rest of you to jump on, right? I think that's a very interesting result. So let's jump to the next design principle, annotated documentation. So documentation is not a particularly hot topic, but it's really interesting. I'll tell you a quick story about Relium to really drive this one home. We've been around for over 17 years, and before the golden age of cloud, we actually had to manage our customer applications inside of data centers that we controlled. And documentation was a really important part of our operation, but it was also a really painful part of our business because a lot of it couldn't be created in a scripted fashion. A lot of it had to be created by hand. And as a result, even with our best efforts, documentation tended to drift from reality. Uh, it made it really hard to rely on when customer issues happen. So if you're in the middle of an operational event, the last thing you want is out-of-date documentation. In cloud, documentation can be created automatically as an artifact of your build process. And the documentation that you generate, it can be useful not only to people, but also to systems. And with that automation, you can have detailed annotated documentation that reflects reality all the time. So at Relium now, as I mentioned before, we're a managed service provider. So we manage hundreds of large cloud workloads on AWS for our customers. And we do automated documentation on their behalf. And it gives our engineers the ability to really, really quickly react in the case of a customer event. So this is a really important advancement for being well architected. So this next design principle is my personal favorite. Frequent, small, reversible changes. So my background is in software, as I mentioned, and I'm pretty well versed in the principles of agile methodologies, mostly because I've seen them used and abused for many years now. And we won't touch too much on whether or not agile has been truly successful or not. But I think one thing that it has done is it's really instilled the concept of iteration, right, within organizations, and that's been pretty accepted. But more often than not, I still think that companies tend to bundle their changes into enormous, chunky releases. And this approach imposes a huge amount of change, not only on customers, but also on dependent systems and components. Well-Architected really recommends a slightly different approach, designing for an environment that is constantly in flux, evolving and improving. And that really requires a different approach to how we design our systems, breaking them down into small, highly focused components that are very resilient to failure and composed together into a single holistic system. And that way, your changes can be rolled out rapidly and rolled back easily if needed. So let's do another quick poll and talk a little bit about your release cadence. So I'm curious to know how many of the group are releasing on a kind of continuous release fashion, continuous deployment fashion, or if you're doing kind of your releases of your software in kind of a weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually basis, or if you just have no cadence at all, right? Typically in no cadence organizations, what I see is they're really basing it around, this is my set of requirements and I will release when all of them are met. And that tends to have a very unpredictable release cadence. Okay, we're getting some votes flowing in here. It's very interesting, this one. Okay, the results are still flowing in. I'll give it another 5 or 10 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and stop the poll. All right, well, look at that. Very interesting. It looks like a significant portion of you is really doing very frequent releases. So either continuous or weekly, with a lot fewer doing less frequent releases in the monthly or quarterly cadence. And the no cadence is tied for the first place there, which I think is really interesting. Doesn't surprise me at all. Like I said, a lot of organizations are really shipping on a release around product features, right? Things that they expect in the requirements. So let's roll on to the next design principle. And that is to refine operations procedures frequently. So this kind of continues on that theme of Agile. So we'll talk about this. So most companies implement Agile methodologies. They have these retrospective meetings, right, on a regular basis. And in most orgs I've been in, they call them retros. And they're a great opportunity for the team to get together, reflect, suggest and create improvements, and help improve, right, make them better. But oddly, the vast majority of companies don't really have a proactive effort, especially on the operations side of the house. And instead, they wait after failures to do post-mortem meetings. it's not to say that postmortems are bad, but taking a more proactive approach and refining your operations procedures on a frequent basis really requires that proactive approach. Well-Architected recommends that you schedule something called game days. A game day meeting is essentially where a team can put their operational procedures to the test in a more controlled way. So you can come up with any number of simulated failure scenarios and actually, in a real environment, go through and have your team test their procedures. And that's a really great way to improve without having to wait for failures to happen. So let's find out from the group if anybody out there is actually doing game days. In my experience, this is a fairly uncommon thing. Looking like that is true as the votes roll in here. Yeah, I can tell you right now, CNN is calling this one for the no crowd. Yep, 85% no so far. Okay. Yeah, so this is a great idea. This is something I definitely suggest you take back to your organizations, is the concept of a game day. And there's some other concepts actually, in fact, one that we're going to talk about right now that integrate really nicely with this. So the next design principle is to anticipate failure. So remember I talked about being proactive, right? In typical operations environments, you're very reactive, right? It's pretty common to find problems in production rather than ahead of time. So Well-Architected definitely says you should do post-mortem exercises, but they also introduce the concept of a pre-mortem. And this is a perfect complement to game days. So in a pre-mortem, you get your team together to brainstorm possible sources of failure and draft failure scenarios, ranking them by likelihood and starting to look at what the cascading effects could be. And then you can put them to the test. So have those game day meetings and validate and test and measure the impact. And trust me, it's much more enjoyable to have a proactive approach than to constantly live in reactive mode. It gets your team really thinking about anticipating that failure and understanding that their lives and their customers' lives and the business's life will be much easier and better if they can get ahead of failure rather than just react to it. So we had 15% of people responding said that they had game days. Let's see how many of you actually do pre-mortems. Okay, results are flowing in. Right. No spoilers. It's looking relatively similar, but not exactly the same, surprisingly enough. Give a couple more seconds for you to vote. All right. So it looks like about 77% of you are not yet doing pre-mortem meetings, but 23% of you are. So it's a little bit higher than the game days. And for those of you who are into that camp where you're doing pre-mortems but not game days, that's a great opportunity for you, right? To take the outputs of those pre-mortem meetings and actually put them into practice in game days to really get the improvements and put them to the test. So speaking of learning, the next design principle for the operational excellence pillar is to learn from all operational failures. And evolution really does require sharing, right? Even if you're anticipating failure and taking a proactive approach, you will have a time where there is an operational failure or event. And Well-Architected Framework really encourages your teams to push on continuous improvement. And that means in the event of a failure, you not only have to have that postmortem, you have to involve as many stakeholders as you can to really fully grasp the full business impact of what had happened. You make sure that the postmortem exercises are blameless in nature. I think that's a very important thing. You solicit a broad set of opinions, share those improvements and lessons throughout the whole organization. And one of the things I love about Well-Architected is that it isn't afraid to broach topics that get to the heart of the company's culture. It's not simply a best practice or procedure. It's a fundamental shift in how your organization has to think about and understand operations. Creating a culture of continuous improvement is really hard, but it's actually definitely worth it. And I think operations teams and product teams have a particularly strong capability to push that kind of culture within their organization. Okay, so we have finished up on the 6 design principles of operational excellence. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the 3 main focus areas. And this is where the rubber really meets the road. So the first part is really preparation. So this is readying yourself for operation. And the first part of that is really about cultivating understanding. I like to say that successful operations teams are enlightened operations teams. And what does that really mean, and what does that look like? Well, the workloads they're responsible for, they have to be experts on. But not only that, they have to understand the shared business goals. They have to understand their own role in achieving those goals and any regulatory or compliance requirements involved. Because without that, it's really, really difficult to prioritize. It's difficult to prioritize anyway, but it's especially difficult if you have no context for setting those priorities. AWS actually does provide some really good resources to help teams set those priorities, including the AWS Knowledge Center, discussion forums, the Support Center, documentation, and also AWS Cloud Compliance, and my favorite, AWS Trusted Advisor, which is a great service that's built right into the AWS console and can be accessed via APIs that gives you a whole set of checks against best practices to help you set your priorities. So in addition to all of those great resources from AWS, one of the most common ways that we as a certified partner are engaged is as an extension of your team, as a consulting partner. We spend a lot of time engaging with our own customers around setting operational priorities on best practices from AWS. So let's have a quick question here. Do you feel that your operations teams are enlightened? Now, remember what I meant here by enlightened. It doesn't mean that they're experts only on the workload. It means that they understand why that workload is important to the business, what the business goals are, right? And they understand their role in achieving those goals, and they understand any compliance or regulatory kind of restrictions that are on them. So this is going to be, I think, a truly interesting one. This one's going to take a little bit longer, I can tell, because you're really having to ponder, is my team truly enlightened? Is our operations team truly enlightened? Okay, I'm going to let it go for a little longer until we get a few more votes here. This is a very interesting one. All right, last chance. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. So interestingly, it looks like only 26% of you attendees think that your teams, your operations teams are really enlightened with all this information. Or you're unsure, 37%, or 37% no. So that, I think, is another great takeaway for attendees, is really helping your teams to have all the information they need to really do their job well. And the next phase here of that preparation is to design for operations. So well-architected workloads, they actually have to be designed in a very intentional way to consider a whole host of operational concerns: deployment and updates, ongoing monitoring and operations. And well-architected workloads also have to be observable by design. And that means that things like logging, instrumentation, metrics gathering, they're all baked right in from the very start. And AWS makes that a lot easier, thanks to the principle of everything as code. So that means everything from infrastructure to policy, operations, and governance can be managed in code. As I mentioned before, we're a managed service provider, and we help drive kind of DevOps transformation for our customers. And one of our key disciplines is really embracing this everything as code kind of principle. Our engineering teams, personally, they use Terraform and AWS CloudFormation. We create that templated infrastructure, version control it, run it through CI/CD pipelines, and we use Ansible and Chef to do automated configuration management. And we even have complete shared tested libraries of cookbooks and templates for common use cases. And that really helps us be designed upfront for operations. AWS also provides a huge number of services and features that are really great for observability. So, for example, AWS CloudTrail, AWS VPC Flow Logs, and CloudWatch, and that's just to name a few. One real recommendation that I have is to encourage you to send your application logs into CloudWatch directly through the APIs. And applications can even publish business and technical metrics directly to CloudWatch. On top of that, another great service I like to recommend to people that I don't think enough attention is really given to is AWS X-Ray, which is a great service that actually lets you track requests from end to end through your application across all the different services that you're leveraging on top of AWS. That's a very cool service. So let's talk about operational readiness, the next part of our preparation focus. So we've talked about technology and we mentioned culture a little bit, but what about process and procedures? So in my experience, the most operationally excellent teams create and maintain a consistent, repeatable, and well-maintained process for operations and deployment. And how do they do that? Well, first thing you have to have is really good docs. Checklists, run books, playbooks, and these things have to actually be put to the test, right? In things like game days and kept up to date. Next, a properly trained and right-sized team. And it's not enough to have the documentation. Your team has to actually know it and follow it. And there's no shortcuts here. And a note to COOs and CTOs and engineering managers present in the webinar today, you need to properly staff the team. That's a very difficult thing to do, but it needs to happen. And finally, you need to ensure that no corners are cut in the process. And you can use governance procedures and automation to really help drive that. And a quick side note here, because I did mention a trained right-sized team, because the demand for AWS certified talent is pretty crazy right now, it's really difficult to build a team and to scale it. So one of the approaches that we've taken at Relium is kind of a university model. We implement a lot of training and education, bring in people who are very junior, and then we incentivize them to stick on board with us by paying for AWS certification for them, right? So they get pro certs and associate certs, and then they stick on board with us, and our team grows with capable people. So it's actually a really nice approach to the problem that I like to share with folks. AWS has some really great training you can put your engineers through. So back to operational readiness. Once you have the right process and procedures in place and you have that right-sized, well-trained team, you got to put them to work by leveraging automation and operations as code to actually codify those runbooks, playbooks, procedures, and so on into automation to reduce risk, right? You can use things like resource tags, event triggers, and other features of AWS to make it happen. So on at Relium, we end up leveraging a lot of systems manager features and Lambda functions and so on to actually automate some of our procedures and processes. So let's do another quick poll. So does your operations team have documented procedures? Now, I'm sure you all have documented procedures. The question is, how well are they documented? We probably could have put a little scale in here, but I'm actually really liking the results I'm seeing. Looks like we have a very good set of responsible folks here. All right, votes are still trickling in. Keep you another 5 or 6 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and stop it. 85% of you, yes, that's great. That is a really good result. So excellent job. So let's move on to the next focus area, which is operation. So in this particular area, it's important to point out that, so I mentioned operations teams that are successful are generally enlightened teams, right? And in this case, it's all about enabling that enlightenment by surfacing as many insights into your infrastructure application environment as possible. So at Relium, we operate a bunch of large-scale workloads on behalf of hundreds of customers, and they've got a very wide set of expectations, requirements, and use cases across many verticals. So some of our customer workloads, for example, demand very low latency and very high throughput, and those customers happily pay the price to ensure those priorities. But others are willing to sacrifice some level of performance, say, to have a cost-effective solution. So the definition of operational health really varies from workload to workload across your key metrics. So it's really, really important for your teams to huddle with your stakeholders in your business to understand which key metrics and outcomes matter to them. What are the priorities of the business? Is performance the top concern? Cost, availability, latency? You really have to balance all of these together to support the ultimate business goals. And once you've got those key metrics in hand, it's time to get to work, because you're going to have to gather a lot of data and aggregate it to create dashboards and alerting around those key metrics. And it sounds daunting, but AWS actually really has helped us in this regard. You can use things like CloudWatch logs, dashboards, or you can create baselines and alerts on those dashboards from a system level and a business level on your key metrics. And we're at Relium big users of Elasticsearch and Kibana, and those can create some really incredible dashboards as well. So gathering all of that data and surfacing, against these key metrics that align with your business requirements is a huge part of being well architected. Next up, let's talk about responding to events. So this is what most people think of when they think of operations. When something goes wrong, what are we going to do? So we've set our operational priorities. We've designed our systems for operations. We have a really good understanding of our operational health and key metrics and alerts. But guess what? We're still going to encounter a problem. It's going to happen. So what does Well Architected have to say about how we respond to events? Well, first off, AWS encourages you to consider business impact during events. This is an often overlooked kind of aspect of operations. If restoring a particular component of your system before others will have a massive positive impact on the business, on the bottom line of the business, let's say by restoring that, you are able to reduce the revenue leakage that's happening, or perhaps a cost to you. That's the thing that should be prioritized first, right? So consider business impact during events. And next, you got to leverage all that great data that you've been collecting and automate your responses. So for example, one of the suggestions in Well Architected is that in the event of a failure during a deployment, you could automate a rollback to a known good version. That'll allow you to take that new version that you were attempting to deploy it in a separate environment that mirrors your production environment, and then do your troubleshooting there, right? To really get to the root of the problem without having to worry about it impacting customers. And you also really need to be sure to embrace AWS's auto-scaling features. So, for example, when a key metric crosses the threshold, CloudWatch alarms can be created, and then you can auto-scale your EC2 instances up or down, and then notify your teams via Amazon SNS notifications. And then, obviously, at the end of an event, once you've navigated it successfully, you've got to perform that root cause analysis and full postmortem. And that should be in your standard operating procedures, and it should involve all of those different stakeholders, right? So that's how we respond to events in the well-architected framework world. So the next area here is evolution. And learning from experience is the first part of that area of focus. And in my experience running operations teams, the most important predictor of success is a passion for learning. I like to cultivate a culture of curiosity and continuous improvement, where every single experience is an opportunity to learn and share and grow. And AWS really fundamentally agrees with this in the well-architected framework. It encourages operations teams to view every incident or event as an opportunity. Obviously, we don't look forward to production issues, but I found that the best teams I've worked with enjoy digging into what went wrong and understanding, getting to the bottom of the problem and learning from that failure. And once collected a large amount of data and about a particular operational event, a thing that's really helped us before is you can take that data and put it into S3, and then you can use Amazon Athena or Amazon QuickSight to actually build really rich insights, right, into what happened. Right? It's very useful. And another tip is that you should make sure to pull in other parts of the business, right? The different points of view that you're going to get out of the different areas of the business can sometimes really help you understand what might have gone wrong. So let's do one more poll here and find out how your organizations view operational events in practice. So do your teams view them as an opportunity to learn, organizational failures, or some combination thereof? I was expecting here to be mostly a mix, a combination. And it's looking like that is actually bearing out. All right, let's go for another minute. All right, let's go ahead and stop the poll. Interesting. So, yeah, just like I had kind of expected, about 65% of you, it's a combination. And actually, it looks like very few of you, your businesses actually view operational events as purely organizational failures. And I think that's a really good sign, right? That's an encouraging thing. Okay, let's go to the last area here. The last area in the evolution focus area is to share our learnings. So one of the fun parts about being an AWS certified MSP is that we have an opportunity to learn from our many customers, right? Because of all the different workloads we see, the hundreds of workloads and dozens of use cases, we really get to see a huge set of issues, right? And our engineers actually crave and enjoy evolving our platform based upon those lessons. And every improvement we make, when we make it for one customer, we can roll those improvements out to all of our other customers as well. So that's a pretty huge benefit. And it's the same for your own businesses, right? I've been in lots of different companies over the years, and I've been in several where the actual org structure is built into product teams. Those product teams have their own operations folks, developers, kind of the entire, siloed product team. And when lessons happen in one product team, those lessons should be shared throughout the rest of the company to get that kind of cross-cutting benefit throughout the entire business. And well-architected really does encourage that kind of evolution. So in summary, we've covered quite a bit of ground today. So let's go through and talk a little bit about what we've discussed. So first, we introduced the AWS Well-Architected Framework and the Well-Architected Review Program. And we talked about the powerful collection of best practices therein. We talked about the Well-Architected Review Program incentives from Amazon, which enable you to use a partner like Relium to get a $5,000 credit along with your well-architected review and some remediation. And then we dived really deep here into the operational excellence pillar. And we talked about the 6 design principles and the 3 main focus areas: preparation, operation, and evolution. And now let's have some time for Q&A. And if you haven't already been, I'd encourage you to go into the questions section here and start entering some questions. I'll try to address a few of them. Let's see. All right, let's see here. Some interesting question. So I got a question here about from Marvin about what game days are. And we talked a little bit about this earlier in the webinar, but game days are really an opportunity for your team to come together and simulate an operational event, right? So in a pre-mortem exercise, you can come up with a list of things that might go wrong. And then during a game day, you get the entire team together and you actually walk through your procedures and processes as that event is happening. So it's a really useful kind of practice. Let's see. Someone asked what my name is. I'm Jonathan LaCour. Let's see. So one of the attendees pointed out that the statistics are definitely that we took in the polls are actually a little bit skewed because there's lots of organizations represented here that are not yet using AWS, and that's true, right? That said, they could be using a different public cloud provider, so it's a little bit hard to say. Another person asked if Relium is using Chef or Ansible or both, and the answer to that question is that we use both, actually. In our experience, we have been Chef users for quite a long time, and we like some of there's a kind of a push versus pull nature between Chef and Ansible, and we have different use cases for both. This is a good question. Lance can probably give a more detailed answer on that. How do we manage multi-region deployment, cloud formation versus Terraform? So again, this is a good one for Lance. I'll say that we have done it with both. And I think Terraform is probably more of our go-to in that particular case. Let's see. Okay, we have another great question here that says, we currently want to stage an event where a database fails. How would we go about that when we are using RDS? And in fact, this particular person, Nicholas, is using Aurora, which is AWS's kind of next generation backend for RDS. So in my experience, what you can actually do is you can create a duplicate or a replica of your environment, and kind of wall it off and make it separate. And then you can essentially use that separate RDS instance to really do that troubleshooting during a game day. Okay, someone in the room asked about what are best practices for hybrid and multi-cloud operations. Well, I think that's slightly outside of the scope of well-architected, because well-architected is really about AWS in particular. But I do think that it's an important thing to consider for organizations that have a multi-cloud or a hybrid cloud strategy. I think I'm going to take that down and note that maybe we should do a future webinar on that. I think it's a really great idea. So thank you, Waiting for Name, who has not put in their name. Can I explain a bit more about annotated documentation? This is from Ashley Kitson. Sure, Ashley. So annotated documentation. So in a cloud environment, you can actually interrogate the environment to discover what's there, right? You can use the API for AWS to say, what EC2 instances exist? What are my IAM kind of roles? What's the size of all of my EBS volumes? How many S3 buckets do I have? You can go through and interrogate the environment and discover things. And from that, you can generate documentation that describes the environment in detail, in a little bit more of either a human readable form or a systems readable form. That becomes very useful in the case of an operational event, right? So if your team needs to understand where things live, they can find it in the documentation. And I'll also point out, you can use tagging and you can use labeling and other sorts of techniques in your infrastructure such that you can map certain infrastructure, bits and pieces of infrastructure to certain purposes. So you can have them tagged and categorized to help make that documentation even more accurate. Now, this is annotated documentation. You should also have other handwritten documentation, right, that is integrated and audited against that annotated documentation. So that was a good question. Robert asks, do you recommend AWS certification, and would it only be available from Amazon? So Amazon has a rigorous kind of certification and accreditation program, and they are pretty difficult tests that you have to get through in order to get your cert, and I do recommend them. We found at Relium that when we hire a person who has AWS certifications, we can trust they can hit the ground running right away. If you're an engineer who is out there in the job market, having AWS certs is a really great way to make sure you're at the top of your market and you're a very appealing and desirable candidate. So yes, I absolutely do recommend it. And yes, it does only come through Amazon, but there are training materials available through a variety of different sources. As I mentioned, at Relium, we actually provide training to our employees to encourage them and help them to get those. Marvin asks, how does a pre-mortem meeting look like in practice? What does it look like in practice? So a pre-mortem meeting is one of my favorite types of meetings to sit on. Engineers, of which I am one, we love looking for problems. Too often we're very negative, right? This is a way to kind of weaponize that for good, to take that power and really, or that kind of approach to things and really help dig into issues. So what you do is you sit around with your team and you start to, maybe you put your architecture up on a whiteboard or up on the screen using your annotated documentation. And you say, okay, what would happen, say, if we lost this particular availability zone or this particular region? Or what happens if, God forbid, somebody deletes our database? Or what happens if there is a major network outage? Or any number of issues. And you start to make a list of the ones that you think are interesting to pursue, that you think could actually stress your system. And one thing I'll point out here is there's a principle that Netflix, who is a big AWS customer, is kind of involved in, which is kind of the chaos principle, which is the notion that you have to embrace the chaos that exists in the world, right? And they have created a bunch of kind of famous projects out there, including one called Chaos Monkey that just randomly kills off infrastructure to make sure that your systems are resilient, right? That's a bit of an aggressive view on it, but a pre-mortem is all about coming up with lists of things that you can then test if they actually are issues in a game day, and then you can fix the problem before it happens in production, and then retest it and validate it in the game day. So Lance is going to go ahead and take one here. Jump on in, Lance.
Hey everyone. So I see a question about using CI/CD on AWS, and there were two tools called out specifically. Um, these types of questions come up a lot in terms of which tool to decide for a particular function or service. And in our experience, there's really no one best tool. There is no one tool fits all. It's really dependent on the environment uh, and up to the team to kind of decide on the tooling that they want to use. Um, Fortunately, if you're already set up with best practices and on your application, your infrastructure is version controlled, it becomes very easy to pivot and to try new services and tools. But for the most part, it is really very dependent on the environment and the application, the team, and the infrastructure. Um, the two tools called out were Code Build and Jenkins, and those are actually two really great tools that we leverage very often. We've had great success in building CI and CD pipelines in Jenkins, and then typically leveraging Code Build for other components and Code Pipeline, Code Deploy, some other AWS services they all kind of have some overlap and hook into each other in various ways. So, Chris, hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Thanks, Lance. So we have a couple more questions in here. And Lance, feel free to jump in if you see any other ones that you want to talk about. Let's see. One of the interesting questions from Simon Murray is, have any of the poll answers particularly surprised me? You know, I think that the one that surprised me the most is likely around the percentage of folks who felt that their operations teams were truly enlightened. I think in hindsight, it shouldn't be surprising, but I think that one is the most interesting to me. Maybe it's not necessarily surprising, but I find it interesting because I think that probably represents the biggest opportunity for every organization. The second that you really empower the folks who are working with your infrastructure with the information that they need about business goals and how they fit in and kind of all the requirements that are on the business, they feel so much more capable of helping you, and they are much more capable of helping. So I think, if I had one big takeaway to give the entire group here, it would be really do try to enlighten your teams. And I think that goes across the entire org, really, helping everybody. Let's see.
All right, got a question from Sam about a tool for monitoring hybrid environments that ops team can leverage. We are a big fan of really any tool that can be pluggable and configured and version controlled. Anything that exposes a REST API that you can build a set of libraries upon. One tool specifically, just to put out a name, we like Site 24/7 for a lot. From within the platform, they expose a REST API that we create libraries and build upon, and we can establish endpoint monitoring for all the various application components and endpoints. And it gets very explicit in terms of when we ping or pull a particular endpoint, we're expecting an HTTP 200 response. It should also deliver a JSON content body in the response, and should have OK statuses. And if you ever see the word error on the page, throw an alert condition. So the Site 24/7 platform is very configurable, and we can automate a lot of our monitor creation and deletion. So that is one tool that we like for monitoring hybrid environments that is very hackable.
Awesome. Thanks, Lance. So real quick, while we still have some of you on, I'll point out I would appreciate it if you did give us some feedback on the webinar on your way out. And I'd also like to remind you this is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to be doing on the Well-Architected Framework. We're going to be publishing a blog post soon that has a lot of the detail that was covered here in a different kind of format. So if you prefer reading, you'll have it there as well. We will also be posting this recording. And if you do have any questions, feel free to keep them coming. I have heard at least another question. Please share the slides too, and absolutely we will. I'll make sure to include those when we are wrapping up the webinar. Also, you can find Reliam on social media at Reliam on Twitter, and I believe elsewhere. Maybe Joshua, if you could put a couple links in the chat for folks to see, and you can find our website at www.reliam.com. And yeah, would love to hear from you, and feel free to get in touch. I'm also available. You can reach me through our contact us page as well if you'd like. And I think that's all of the questions for the day. I really appreciate everyone coming out, and definitely give us some feedback so we can make the next one even better, and have a good evening.